Imagine Bishop T.D. Jakes and Bishop Noel Jones, two of America's most prominent and influential pastors, engaged in a bitter rivalry that almost split the church community. Rumors of enmity, envy, and treachery surrounded these two spiritual titans for years. However, what was the root reason of the rift? More significantly, how did they eventually get along after decades of conflict? We're revealing one of the most startling behind-the-scenes tales in contemporary ministry today. And believe me, the reality will leave you speechless. In the realm of contemporary ministry, the names of Bishop T.D. Jakes and Bishop Noel Jones are highly significant. Both men established religious empires, guiding millions of followers, affecting not only congregations but the Christian community as a whole, and forming gospel culture. However, these two spiritual titans were enmeshed in a few behind the scenes that persisted for years. Ego wasn't the only factor. It was more than just celebrity, and it was more than just power. Many churchgoers, leaders, and gospel communities were split as a result of their deeper dispute. What specifically caused the conflict between them? Did it have to do with charges of treachery, leadership styles, or even financial rivalries related to the commercial side of ministry? And probably most importantly, what happened to enable them to finally take a seat and work out their long-standing problems? We're going to walk you through the little-known tale of how two of America's most revered preachers went from being at odds to eventually coming to terms in this video. We'll learn startling facts about their repercussions, the incidents that almost ended their romance, and the unexpected turn of events that led to their reconciliation. What you're about to hear goes beyond gossip, so stay with me through to the very end. It's a lesson in forgiveness, humility, and leadership that might permanently alter your perspective on church leaders. We must first comprehend the personalities of Bishop T.D. Jakes and Bishop Noel Jones prior to the drama developing in order to comprehend their rivalry. Their ascents to fame were everything from typical. Additionally, their accomplishments paved the way for an unparalleled rivalry. Born in South Charleston, West Virginia, T.D. Jake had a modest upbringing. Despite not being born into wealth or celebrity, he possessed vision, tenacity, and an indisputable ability for preaching. He started his ministry with just a few people in the early 1980s. But what distinguished him from almost every other pastor at the time was his dynamic preaching style, his ability to relate scripture to challenges in real life, and his intensely emotional delivery. By the mid-1990s, Jake had relocated his ministry to Dallas, Texas, where he established the Potter's House, a megachurch that became a worldwide brand with millions of followers on television and the internet and over 30 members. He was more than a mere pastor. In both religious and secular communities, he rose to fame as a writer, filmmaker, and household celebrity. Noel Jones, meanwhile, rose in a different manner. He was born in Spanish Town, Jamaica, and hailed from a spiritually influenced household. Noel carried on his father's legacy of being a bishop. Jones, who was well known for his thought-provoking sermons, combined theology with a witty sense of humor and a powerful stage presence. He immediately rose to prominence as one of the most well-respected voices in the West Coast religious world after taking over as pastor of the City of Refuge Church in Los Angeles, California. Thousands of people joined his church as a result of his charisma and wisdom, many of whom were influencers, sports, and celebrities. Both men achieved incredible levels of celebrity by the late 1990s and early 2000s. This is where things become more tricky though. Influence frequently turns into power in the ministry, and power can occasionally lead to rivalry. Comparisons between the two men were unavoidable when T.D. Jake emerged as the spokesperson for the contemporary megarch movement, and Noel Jones maintained his position as one of the leading voices in gospel preaching. They were pitted against one another by members, pastors, and even the media. Which preacher was superior? Who was more powerful? More souls were reached by whom? Long before either man officially addressed the strain, these queries stoked rumors of enmity. Furthermore, the spotlight only serves to highlight the flaws when spiritual leadership is combined with notoriety, wealth, and influence. However, this was only the start. Not until both men were at the center of allegations, betrayals, and misunderstandings that rocked not only their friendship, but also the congregations observing from the sidelines did the true feud start. This is where it becomes even more startling. According to some insiders, the conflict had little to do with theology. It had to do with something much more profound, something that both men attempted to conceal. Every rivalry has a tipping point, when inward antagonism turns into overt hostility. That time arrived for Bishops T.D. Jakes and Noel Jones when rumors of parallels started to escalate into direct charges, not only from followers but also from church authorities. With the rapid expansion of the Potter's House and his media empire, T.D. Jakes had already established himself as a national celebrity. His sermons were transmitted into millions of homes worldwide, his films were seen by a wide audience, and his books were at the top of bestseller lists. Some even started referring to him as the Oprah of the pulpit, implying that his impact went much beyond his church's boundaries. He gained respect all across the world as a result of this recognition, but it also drew criticism. Some accused him of being overly commercial and blurring the boundaries between business and ministry. Noel Jones, meantime, had amassed a devoted fan base. Jones's Los Angeles church attracted celebrities because to his fiery delivery and intelligence. Gospel singers and well-known people, he was more than a mere pastor. He was a cultural icon who was invited to international summits, conferences, and conventions. However, his ascent was not without controversy. Critics pointed to his expensive cars, outfits, and Hollywood contacts to accuse him of leading an extravagant lifestyle. His bachelor lifestyle was questioned by others, particularly as reports surfaced regarding his personal relationships. The difference between the two individuals was quickly noticed by onlookers. Jones was perceived as the intelligent, occasionally erratic outlaw, while Jakes was perceived as the polished empire-building leader. Their supporters started stoking the flames, with some claiming that Jones was more authentic, and others claiming that Jake was the real face of contemporary ministry. What ought to have been constructive leadership and diversity started to take the form of a rivalry story. The true spark, however, was when speaking engagements and conference invites began to become contentious. Even though both men were in great demand, event planners occasionally had to pick one over the other. There were rumors that Noel Jones felt marginalized at times because he thought Jake's celebrity was overshadowing his own ministry accomplishments. However, others in Jake's group believed that Jones purposefully made incisive theological statements in his sermons, perhaps in an effort to undermine Jake's style of preaching. According to insiders, a specific conference in the early 2000s was the tipping point. Although both men were supposed to show there, what really happened behind the scenes was combustible. There were intense arguments over who would be the primary speaker, according to people with knowledge of the matter. Although the specifics were never disclosed to the public, the consequence was evident as the tension reached a boiling point. The two bishops ceased going out together in public in the months that followed, avoided one another at important gatherings, and hardly ever mentioned one another by name in sermons. It wasn't just a personal feud, the entire church community was impacted. People started picking sides. Even though it was still in its infancy at the time, social media widened the gap. Depending on who you asked, videos and articles emerged portraying one as the victim and the other as the villain. It was no longer merely a friendly competition. It was now a noticeable crack that caused others in the ministry community to take notice. This is the bit that most folks missed. The public believed that the fight was about rivalry and ego, while insiders hinted that there were more serious problems involved. Some claimed it was related to financial transactions involving joint ventures. Others alluded to private miscommunications that had been simmering for years. Some even implied jealousy of power in political and celebrity circles. One thing was certain, regardless of the reality. Noel Jones and T.D. Jakes' relationship had gotten to a breaking point. However, division is not where this narrative ends. Even their most scathing detractors would be shocked by what transpired next, because a string of unforeseen circumstances compelled both men to tackle their disagreements head-on when the stress peaked. The conflict between Bishop Noel Jones and Bishop T.D. Jake seemed to the public to be an unspoken Cold War. Neither man had any explosive news conferences or public outbursts. Both continued to use caution when speaking. However, behind closed doors, animosity was building until it became impossible for the two leaders to ignore each other. In the early 2000s, there were multiple attempts at secret encounters according to insiders. Church officials, other bishops, trusted associates, and even relatives intervened to try to defuse the situation. Observing Jake and Jones as models of leadership and harmony, they saw that the longer the rift persisted, the more harm it would do to the greater faith community as well as to Jake and Jones. The breaking point is frequently cited as a specific meeting that was avoided by cameras and reporters. It wasn't about public image or well-crafted sermons in that room. Decades of unresolved misunderstandings, unresolved bitterness, and raw passion were all involved. Noel Jones believed he had been undervalued and overshadowed for a long time, according to those familiar with the matter. According to reports, he said that his voice was equally important in the kingdom as Jake's. But Jake's achievements were frequently downplayed or disregarded due to his commercial reach and media empire. Jones, who was renowned for his courage and intelligence, was never afraid to voice his opinions. Some claim that even those attempting to mediate were astonished by the outbursts of his wrath. Jake, on the other hand, reportedly voiced his displeasure at what he perceived as needless competition. He had put a great deal of personal expense, sacrifice, and effort into building his ministry. It had been taxing to head the Potter's home, deal with detractors, and manage national expectations. The notion that he was purposefully ignoring Noel Jones was not only untrue, but it was also extremely upsetting to Jake. He desired appreciation for the spiritual struggles and restless nights that accompanied his influence. It was not a simple or peaceful confrontation. Tempers rose and voices were raised. Later, those there characterized it as a battle of titans, with neither side initially prepared to concede. Here's the amazing part, though. What might have ended their relationship completely ended up being the turning point that allowed them to get back together. Why? Because both guys finally revealed secrets they had been keeping to themselves for years in that unvarnished, unadulterated conversation. Jones wasn't just jealous, Jake realized. He had a strong desire to prevent Jake's exaggerated persona from overshadowing his function in the kingdom. Jones understood that Jake wasn't purposefully obscuring him. He was merely functioning on an attention-demanding scale that he had been thrown into by international prominence. However, it took some time to resolve. They weren't immediately best friends after that encounter. Rather, they withdrew to their own social groups to digest the remarks and consider the extent to which their conflict had already weakened the church's unity. Both continued to stay away from one another in public places for weeks and months after that. However, something had changed. No longer was the wall of quiet completely impenetrable. The twist that most people were unaware of is this. This pivotal encounter paved the way for an unforeseen chain of events that would make both men rethink everything. Not only their conflict, but also their vocations, priorities, and even their heritage. Because sometimes a relationship can be repaired without disagreements. It's the ensuing crises. And those crises were approaching sooner than anyone could have imagined for both T.D. Jake and Noel Jones. Pride gives way to vulnerability at some point in every great story of reconciliation. For Bishop Noel Jones and Bishop T.D. Jakes, that moment did not occur on a stage or in a boardroom. It took place in their private lives, which were frequently silent and difficult. Both men achieved levels of power by the mid-2000s teenagers that were beyond the reach of most pastors. However, achieving success came with a lot of demands, difficulties, and life-changing situations that neither of them could handle by themselves. Running the Potter's house was more than just preaching to Jakes. It involved controlling a media empire, managing a multinational corporation, dealing with many employees, and continuously responding to public scrutiny. He was known as a rock of strength behind the pulpit. In private, however, he experienced emotional stress and fatigue that caused him to doubt choices and look for direction. Conversely, Noel Jones was negotiating his own personal problems. He had the duty of attending to the spiritual and private needs of thousands of people as the leader of a large Los Angeles church with well-known members. Moments of extreme loneliness were brought on by family issues, health problems, and the constant burden of public expectations. According to people close to him, he also started thinking back on the conflict with Jake, but not with rage, but rather with the understanding that years of hostility had squandered valuable energy that could have been put toward ministry. Mutual friends and mentors started gently encouraging them to get back together during these vulnerable times. Reputable leaders in both groups reminded them of their joint goal of sharing the gospel and changing people's lives while also highlighting the biblical concept of forgiveness. Once impossible conversations suddenly became essential. One particularly pivotal incident, according to several insiders, happened while both men were at a spiritual seminar centered on personal development and healing leadership. It turned out that they were sitting in the same breakout session. Although neither had intended to speak to the other directly, the situation compelled them to be close. Both bishops were asked to give a personal account of their struggles at that session. Jake talked openly on the loneliness that comes with being a leader, acknowledging his emotional exhaustion and periods of uncertainty. He talked about how, despite his best efforts, he had occasionally felt misunderstood and how hard it had been to keep relationships going when the demands of ministry and celebrity took up so much of his time. Jones came next, and his account was just as instructive. He talked candidly about the loneliness that spiritual guides experience, the sacrifices they make for the church, and the weight of continually being judged against others, even well-respected coworkers like Jake's. From the outside, what may have appeared to be pride or rivalry was actually a reflection of their common human struggles. Both men were struggling with exhaustion, expectations, and the burden of leadership. The moment had a strong, almost cinematic quality. Attendees later characterized the mood as intensely passionate and electrifying. Empathy and mutual recognition started to erode the barriers that had been erected between them over years of miscommunication. For the first time, the two men viewed one another as fellow servants of a higher calling rather than rivals. Under the same spiritual flag, two leaders are engaged in comparable conflicts. The road to reconciliation quickened from that point on. They started having private talks about the past, what went wrong, and what may be done differently that are thoughtful, methodical, and courteous. Both men made public and private promises to restore trust, acknowledged their shortcomings, and offered forgiveness where necessary. However, despite the advancements, the narrative wasn't totally seamless. There were persistent skepticism, subliminal pressures from their congregations, and the media's constant scrutiny. At this level, reconciliation is never instantaneous. It necessitates humility, patience, and an understanding that mending takes time. The most amazing thing is that they not only had their relationship fixed by the end of this procedure, but they had also become stronger. Once threatening to split churches and erode communal trust, their feud had turned into a demonstration of the strength of empathy, forgiveness, and compassion. The reconciliation was more than a personal matter. Soon, both bishops would make a daring public move that would startle the church community and demonstrate to everyone, pastors and pastors alike, what true humility and unity look like. Bishop T.D. Jakes and Bishop Noel Jones ultimately took the brave decision to make their reconciliation public after years of conflict, private arguments, and intense introspection. This was more than a casual conference snapshot or a handshake on stage. The entire gospel and ministry world was rocked by this kind, well-planned recognition of their journey from rivalry to respect. At a significant religious gathering in Los Angeles, the first indication of a public thaw appeared. Years ago, it would have been unimaginable for both men to be invited to speak on the same platform. The audience watched closely as the two titans of ministry shared the platform, oblivious to the depth of their private reconciliation. Jake's strong presence began the discussion with a sincere admission of previous miscommunications. He discussed the demands of leadership, the dangers of arrogance, and the value of humility in the ministry. He first avoided mentioning Jones by name, but his message of forgiveness and solidarity had the audience listening intently. Noel Jones then stepped up to the podium. Known for his charm and eloquence, he offered his own thoughts, reiterating themes of understanding, humility, and respect for one another. The scene was electrifying when he finally spoke to Jake directly. A handshake, a shared smile, and a noticeable nod said a lot to the audience. Millions of people who saw the event in person and through live streaming witnessed these great leaders' humanity for the first time. They were not competitors. They were spiritual brothers who had triumphed over arrogance, miscommunication, and the demands of society. The effect was instantaneous. Social media was inundated with comments, videos, screenshots, and sincere words from both fans and congregations, thanking the bishops for leading by example in terms of forgiveness and reconciliation. Interviews and articles started to circulate, emphasizing how these two guys, who had previously been perceived as rivals, had opted for togetherness rather than conflict. However, the reconciliation was not just symbolic. Jakes and Jones started working together on mentorship programs, joint sermons, and charity endeavors, demonstrating the real impact of their rekindled connection. They turned into real-life examples of how even the most painful and well-publicized disputes may be turned into opportunities for constructive change. Insiders disclosed that their personal friendship also became stronger behind the scenes. They started giving each other counsel, encouraging one another through difficulties in ministry, and even commemorating achievements together. What began as a rivalry that strained followers and endangered reputations had transformed into a collaboration that increased their legacy and bolstered their power. There is more to the story of TD Jake and Noel Jones than just their animosity. It teaches patience, humility, and the value of forgiving. It serves as a reminder that understanding, empathy, and purposeful communication can lead to reconciliation regardless of how deeply ingrained a problem gets. It proves to leaders, preachers, and common people alike that pride is fleeting. However, the effects of mended connections can last a lifetime. We are reminded that even the most prominent leaders are fallible human beings who may exhibit both incredible grace and mistakes as we consider their journey from rising stars to rivals to reconciled spiritual giants. Their story is transformative as well as noteworthy, giving hope that even long-standing disputes can be resolved if individuals are prepared to listen, comprehend, and extend forgiveness. Therefore, keep TD Jakes and Noel Jones in mind the next time you believe that dispute cannot be resolved. Two guys who transformed conflict into inspiration, rivalry into solidarity, and tension into mentoring. And who knows, maybe their narrative will encourage the leaders of the future to put harmony before competition.